So today we're starting our prep for the third exam, and we'll start out with Unit 1, which is largely looking at just this introduction to econ. And this Unit 1, we saw it's very much just, hey, it's very similar to what we do in both macro and micro, and it just gives that overall introduction to econ so we can kind of see what's going on and so on. So we started out with in Unit 1, we started out talking about what is economics, and another way you can think about that is why do we care? Right. So besides you saying, "Oh, well, I have to take econ because it's a requirement," or whatever the case may be, why do you actually care, and why would we want to be here? And the big reason for this was this idea, or is it still is this idea called scarcity. And basically, what scarcity says is that we have limited resources, but unlimited wants. Right? So everybody wants to do stuff, everybody wants everything they can get, but there are only so many resources out there, so we have those scarce resources. And what we look at in econ is an overall question that we ask is how do we manage our scarce resources? And everything we did comes down to that one. Everything we did really comes down to that one question. It may not be like super obvious all the time, but it comes down to that how we're managing our scarce resources and how those work. So to help manage them, what we got into was this. We said, well, if we're trying to produce goods, right, we want to find a way to efficiently produce goods. So to do this, what we got into was this idea of a division of labor. What division of labor looked at, it said that um, basically everybody can do one part of a production process. So when you think about divisional labor, this can be broken down either within a firm, within a country, or within an entire across the world. But if we just think about within one individual firm, if you go, you get a job, right? Your job is, say, you decide to become an economics professor, right? If that's your job is to teach economics courses, right? It's not necessarily to go out and understand every fine detail of financial aid. It's not necessarily to go out and know every detail about registration rules or everything like that. Instead, your job is to develop and teach econ courses, right? Someone else deals with financial aid, someone else deals with accounting, someone else deals with political science, and so on. So we have that divisional labor. Everybody produces a good that's based off of what they can produce. And in general, what we see is that division of labor is going to lead to more production. And again, that's because instead of me as an individual trying to go around and manage 1,000 different projects, I get to focus on, I guess in our case, be 1 to maybe 3 projects going on, where we're considering the class as a project. But you have kind of 3, 4 things going on that you're really into, that you really know what you're doing with, rather than jumping in and doing these 1,000 different tasks. That and half of them you don't know what to do with them. So we have that division of labor. So also when we earlier in when we were early in our chapter, we got into a talk about how to actually organize. So how to organize an economy. And we had kind of 3 ways that we could do this. We had what's called traditional, a command, and a market economy. And each of these had their own characteristics, their own traits, and all that stuff. So, a traditional, largely what we see is that we do things the way we've always done them. Okay. So, I'm going to say, and this could be through either family lineage, that is, what did your parents do, what did their parents do, and so on, or this could be by some observable characteristic. So in this case, we mean by like observable characteristics. Maybe we say, well, there's certain jobs for this group, there's certain jobs for this group, and so on. But with the family lineage side, what we're saying is, well, my dad worked here, my or my parents worked here, my grandparents worked here, my great grandparents worked here, so I work there, right? Or I do the same thing that my parents did. The second thing we see is called a command economy, and with this one, we're going to see that the government or some central power is going to make economic decisions. And the two big economic decisions we see is what gets produced. And when we say what, we're looking at how, by who, and how much um, quantity. Right, so we have those. So what's getting produced? We also want to know what price to charge for goods. And the other thing that what price gets to charge is how do these goods uh, get distributed? So how do we distribute these goods? In this case, again, the command economy, the central power, or this government is going to make these decisions that uh, of really how everything works and so on. And the third thing we had was a market economy and a command. You may also see a buzzword come up. It's centralized. A market economy is going to be decentralized, and we're going to see that the market makes decisions, uh, or we're going to say that the market makes economic decisions. So in this case, the decisions are made by the interaction of buyers and sellers. Okay. So if you want to go out and if you want to go buy lunch or you want to go do whatever it is you want to buy, you can go out and buy it. And if it's a price that you're willing to pay, you can go out and pay that price. If it's not, you pass on it or you say you just don't buy it at that point. So again, we have this for the market economy. Keyword here: decentralized, command decentralized. In general, a market, we're not worried about government. Command enjoys government. Traditional kind of does its own thing. So after we talked about our types of economies, we got into we kind of got into chapter 2, which looked at kind of the economic mindset. And the big idea from this chapter was, how do we make a decision? How do we decide whether I purchase something or not? How do I decide whether, uh, how do I just decide what I do? And to do this, what we got into was a talk about marginal analysis. And with this marginal analysis, largely what we wanted to do is compare the benefits and costs of taking an action, or of either taking an action or purchasing a good. And when we looked at our marginal analysis, we talked about marginal benefit, marginal cost, which is just how much extra benefit or cost does something bring. Um, but one of the things we got into was this idea of a sunk cost. And with the sunk cost, what we said with this was this is a cost that is already spent or committed and cannot be recovered. Um, and the tip with these and what we generally want to do is in general, we said that we want to ignore our sunk costs. We ignore sunk costs and instead focus on our marginal benefit and our marginal cost. So when we think about our marginal analysis, and that's kind of the first part of this second chapter that we had. But then we moved in and we talked about production and excuse me, all that good stuff. And one of the ideas we got into as we kept going through this chapter was called the production possibility frontier. And with this, largely what we're looking at is what goods are we able to produce, or what allocations of good are we able to produce. So let's say just that. And the interesting thing about the production possibility frontier was that we saw that this was bowed out. So what this looked at was something like this. So we have two goods, say fish and corn, and it took this bowed out shape that looked something like that, right? And kind of the reason it took that shape was because people are the example I use is a dollar, but a person is not necessarily just a person, right? So we all have different trade offs, we all have different skill sets, and so on. So whereas if you came into a store, you have a dollar bill or a 20 or whatever, they don't care where that it's from. They don't care if it's a new or an old dollar. The only thing they care about is it real or is it not? If it's real and it's worth something. If it's not worth anything. But again, people are a little bit different in the sense that we're not robots. We're not just a dollar bill. Instead, as people, we have again these different skill sets, different so on. So, and if you just think about something like school, personally, I was pretty good at math, but not that great at English. Uh, or I was good at math and writing, but not that great at like lit or stuff like that. So, right, we have our strong things, we have our things that we're not so great in. There are other people who, they loved lit, maybe they loved lit but hated math, right? So, we have those different skill sets, those different trade-offs. And again, we're not just uh as people, we have again those different skill sets, different trade-offs, and so on. And that's largely why we see this PPF take that bowed out curve. So after we introduced our PPF, we kind of got into we kind of got a little critics of the economic mindset. And with this, we introduced kind of two things. I'm just going to get to them and then move on. But the first is that people don't act rationally all the time. That is, we don't always sit and say, well, what's the benefit and what's the cost of doing something? So one, people don't. But the second thing we saw with this is people shouldn't necessarily go out, have a quote perfect economic mindset. So I shouldn't say, well, what's the benefit? What's the cost? Right. In some instances, that may lead you to actually do something that's really not very desirable. Whereas, right, we kind of have issues that can come up. So econ, again, it's not a moral science. Instead, it's just saying, hey, it's not a class. What's the phrase? We phrase it as this isn't a class of moral instruction, but rather kind of a mindset and so on. There are things we can take from it, but again, we don't want to sit and say, "Oh, well, this looks good economically, so I'm going to do this," right? Because again, that can lead you to do some really not so great things. So after we got in through chapter 2, moved into chapter 3, which focused on demand and supply. And when we look at these, what we saw, um, so kind of the first thing we had our graph, right? Then we had price on the Y, quantity on the X. We had a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, where these two intersect gave us our equilibrium. And our equilibrium was found at this price where we have Q star and P star. And again, P star was our equilibrium price, whereas Q star is our equilibrium quantity. In our equilibrium, we're looking for some price or some price and quantity where our quantity supplied is equal to our quantity demanded. And that brings us into a pretty big distinction that we had. Um, excuse me. So we had this fairly large distinction between supply and demand and quantity supplied. So if we look at demand and supply, remember we looked at what or excuse me, what we're looking at is how many goods are either consumers or are buyers or sellers willing and able to either purchase or produce. How many goods are buyers willing and able to purchase or produce at all prices? So as you go through this, again, demand is going to take that upper side, supply is going to take the lower half of this, and at all prices. So this first one refers to the entire curve, right? So this demand is the demand curve, and same thing with the supply. This is the supply curve. So the other thing that we saw, and I'm going to shorthand this a little bit and cheat just a little bit, do a copy and paste, because but I'm going to change two things between this and the one we just did. So second group of things we have is called our quantity demand and quantity supplied, which is often abbreviated as either QD or QS. And it's same thing, almost the same thing, but the main difference is right here at the very end. Instead of at all prices, it's going to be at a given price. So again, QD or QS is one individual point, rather than the entire curve. So when we think about our demand and supply, we got into things that shift demand, things that shift supply. So If we think about shifting demand or supply, I first want to encourage you to, I'm not going to sit and go over every one of these, but look over the reasons or causes of a shift in demand or supply. And two of them that kind of had the whole where things are kind of different. The first thing that can affect this was our income. And for income, we had two types of goods. The first called a normal good, where as my income rises, I will see my uh, demand will increase as well. Then we had an inferior, where with this we saw is that as our income rises, will lead to our demand to actually fall. So we had our income based shifts. But we also had based off of relations of goods. So how are two goods related to each other? The first thing that we saw was a substitute. And with the substitute we saw is the price of good A were to rise, then the demand for good B would rise as well. So if I go to the store and Coke is, and if I go to the store to buy Coke and I get there and it's $20 for a 12 pack, I might be more willing to switch over to Pepsi instead of buying Coke. On the other side, we have our complements. With this, the price of good A rises, then the demand for good B will fall. So with this, what we're seeing is the example I use was like a peanut butter jelly sandwich. So if the price of peanut butter goes up, that makes the sandwich more expensive. If the sandwich is more expensive, we buy less sandwiches. If I buy less sandwiches, I buy less peanut butter. So, right, we have that relationship between the two goods and really what we see happen. So when we shift our demand supply, that's what causes them. But then we want to remember um, that an increase in demand or supply causes a shift to the right, while a decrease in demand or supply will lead to a shift to the left. So we have these two things, we have these two shifts, and I'm just going to do one of them really quick. But if we had a graph, right, then we have our price and our quantity. I have a downward sloping demand curve and upward sloping supply curve. So we'll suppose that I have an increase in demand. So we'll take a quick little note of our initial equilibrium. P star, Q star. If we have this increase in demand, we're going to see our demand curve shift over to the right, up to, say, D1. And this is going to give us a new equilibrium up here. And at this new equilibrium, we have Q1 and P1. So if we have an increase in demand, what we see happen is that our quantity will increase and our price will increase as well. And same thing, you can play with them around a little bit. You can have a decrease in demand, an increase in supply, or decrease in supply. But you kind of just want to approach it the same way no matter what. The other situation we can have is, what if something happens where both supply and demand change? So, suppose that we have an increase in supply. Excuse me. So we have an increase in supply, but a decrease in demand. So in this case, as we can imagine, we'll have our price and our quantity. And what this one we do is we want to take it step by step. So we start out with this increase in supply, which will shift our supply curve to the right to about, say, there. So in this case, what we first saw, we have our price and our quantity. So we saw it after this first move, our price went down, but our quantity went up. So we'll just make a little note of that, right? That increase in supply caused that. However, now we also have a decrease in demand. So we will cut our demand back a little bit, say back here. And now our equilibrium. So first it went from our initial to S2 or S1. Now it's going to go from S1 down to D1. So our new equilibrium would be somewhere down here. And we said our price continues to fall and our quantity falls to some degree. So we have this decrease in demand, we have another drop in price, but going back with our quantity, we can't really tell. Or we have a decrease in quantity too. So from these events, we know for sure that our price will fall, but our quantity is what we call ambiguous, which basically just means you can't necessarily tell whether it rose or fall because you have these two forces that are pushing against each other. Whereas again, for price, we had two forces pushing the price down. So some things we can see as we go through. So then we introduced our price controls. And what price controls looked at was tools that we have to regulate our prices. And with these, we saw two main types. The first was called the price floor, which is a legal minimum price. That a firm can charge for a good. And if we're on a price floor, we're going to see happen is, excuse me, when we have a price floor, we're going to say that it's binding if the price floor is greater than our equilibrium price. And this will tend to lead to, I'll just say, this leads to a surplus of goods. Because the goods are above market price. Since they're above market price, nobody wants to pay for them. So we have the surplus of goods. On the other side, we can have what's called a price ceiling. And this will be a legal maximum price. And with this, we're going to say our price ceiling is binding if the price ceiling is less than our equilibrium price. And this will lead to a shortage of goods. Since the item or since the good is priced below market price or below market value, it's going to cause that shortage. So it leads to a shortage, whereas up here we had a surplus. So I have our price ceilings and price floors. And one of the things we got into with our, as we were closing out our chapter on supply and demand, we got into a little talk about kind of three things: efficiency, but we had, again, three things: consumer surplus, which is what a consumer would pay for a good; minus what they had to pay; Then we have what's called producer surplus. And this is uh, what a firm sold a good for, minus what they would have been willing to sell for. And then we had our total surplus, our total or our social surplus. And this is just equal to our consumer plus our producer surplus. So when we put these together, right, we had our price and our quantity. Again, we had a downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. Then we had our equilibrium price right about here. I guess we had an equilibrium quantity too. So when we have the perfectly free market, we had our consumer surplus up here between the demand curve and the market price. And we had our producer surplus down here between the price and the supply curve. But the next thing that we looked at, we said, cool, we have that, but what do our price controls actually do to this? So suppose we have a binding price ceiling. So in this case, we have the same thing. We have price, quantity, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. We have this binding price ceiling, which will be less than our equilibrium price. So, and up here, sorry, I should have mentioned this. Our total surplus would be this entire triangle. But down here, we're going to see something a little bit different. So we only produce the maximum of what we either sell or, excuse me, if we have a price control, we're going to actually make the minimum of our supply and demand, or that's actually what's going to get sold. So now we have this new quantity down here, and our pricing will be at that price control. So when you see this, we see our producer surplus comes down and takes this little triangle right here. But our consumer surplus, you only have surplus for the things that you actually purchase. So our consumer surplus kind of takes this shape up here. And then we have this little area here, and if we were to look at our total, we see our total surplus now is this, whatever this is called, we were total surplus. But then we have this gap right here, this triangle, and this will represent what's called our deadweight loss. And again, this DWL stands for deadweight loss. And this is the loss in total surplus from either a price control or a tax. Okay. So we have our price controls, and that's what we can expect to happen with them. Then there was a little bit about labor and financial markets. Looking at them a little bit, just understand how they work. Largely, again, this was an application of Chapter 3, so I'm not really going to dive too much into it. But just be comfortable with them. The couple main things to watch out for is in our labor market, for our graph, we have wages and quantity of workers. So we have a wage instead of price. Then we'll have our demand and supply. So again, we'll get an equilibrium quantity and wage. And in the financial market, we have interest rates. So again, for these folks, they'll have an R instead of price. And again, they'll have a quantity. So they have demand, supply, where they intersect, they get an equilibrium interest rate and an equilibrium quantity of money. So again, the two things they'll see come up with that. So the last topic we got into with Unit 1, and this last bit is only for micro, so if anybody from macro is watching this in the future, uh, you don't have to worry about this last chapter. But the last little bit we looked at was elasticity. And what this looked at is how much does quantity change? Or how much does either a quantity demand or quantity supply change when prices change? Remember, to do this, what we did, we used what's called the midpoint method. So we said that our elasticity, say a demand, is equal to the percent change in quantity divided by the percent change in, say, price. And we said this came out to Q2 minus Q1 over Q2 plus Q1 divided by 2 divided by P2 minus P1 over P2 plus P1 divided by 2. And if we take that, we'll get our elasticity for anything. But what we ended up getting was we can have three kind of states where our elasticity can be. So if the absolute value of our elasticity is less than 1, then we have a good that is considered then we have a good that's considered inelastic. If our elasticity is greater than 1, our good is considered elastic. And if our elasticity is equal to 1, then we call this unitary elastic. Unitary, let's spell that right. Unitary elastic. And then we can change basically anything here. So we had percent change in price. We can also do percent change in income or whatever the case is. A couple applications that we saw with this, with our elasticity, is one was income. So, and this would be phrased as our elasticity is equal to our percent change in QD divided by our percent change in income. And we'll use the same form we saw up there, midpoint method, and so on. But with this, we'll see is, in this case, if our elasticity is greater than 0, then we have a normal good. And if our elasticity is less than 0, then we have an inferior good. Then the second application, and the last thing that I'm going to have for right now, is going to be looking at relations of goods. So for this one, we'll say that elasticity is equal to the percent change in the quantity demanded of good A divided by the percent change in the price of good B. So in this case, if our elasticity is greater than 0, this means that as price rises, our quantity rises as well. This means that we'll have a substitute, whereas if our elasticity is less than 0, then we will have a complement. And that's where I'm going to end this video. We'll pick up on the next video with Unit 2 and then Unit 3.